Let's go back for a moment. Before the hotel, before the flowers, before the whole housekeeper punchline. What I want you to understand is this. By the time I showed up at Jade's engagement party, I was already really good at being invisible. It's a learned art, staying out of the shot while holding everything together. The way you find yourself at the edge of every photo, blurry and half-cropped, but always there just off frame. That was my specialty. There's a certain mix of humility and practicality that comes from simply doing the work, covering the bills, solving the logistics, replaying the calendar in your head when someone else forgets what day it is. You keep choosing just this once until just this once becomes your actual whole life, and then one day you're standing in a hotel ballroom being introduced as the help, and something that had been building for 6 years finally has nowhere left to go. I'm not looking for credit here. I want to say that clearly because the version of this story that's easiest to tell is the one where I'm the noble, quietly suffering older sister. And that's not quite right either. I did what I did because when our dad went down with a stroke, gone one random afternoon with no warning at all, I realized how little there was between us and nothing. Mom fell apart after that, the specific, slow way people fall apart when the person they organized their whole life around is suddenly not there anymore. By the time she got her cancer diagnosis, she didn't last 6 months. We buried her the winter after Jade turned 21. It was cold and ugly and mean, the way grief is when it doesn't give you time to prepare between rounds. Just like that, our family shrank from 4 to 2. No grandparents left, no aunts waiting in the wings. Just me and Jade, with the echo of parents gone and the particular, terrible quiet of a house that used to have more people in it. You don't choose that kind of role, the kind where you set aside what you'd planned for yourself because someone else needs you more. It happens one decision at a time. I deferred grad school, something I had worked genuinely hard to earn a spot in, telling myself it would be a year. Then another year. By the time I stopped keeping count, just helping Jade until she sorts herself out, had sprawled into 6 years that I'd never quite consented to as a unit, only ever as a series of individual reasonable choices that added up to something I'd never explicitly agreed to. I started picking up more freelance gigs alongside my regular job, turning my own budget into a kind of origami, stretching each fold to cover university fees across 4 years, every semester's tuition, every textbook, every registration deadline. Her first apartment when she moved to a new city, rent and deposit, and months of the inconsistent gig-based income she was building from, the months where the numbers didn't quite work without someone backstopping them quietly. The business idea came in her 3rd year after graduation. A boutique selling clothing and accessories from small designers she'd been discovering and following for years. Something she had genuine taste and genuine vision for. I made sure the seed capital was there. Not a loan exactly, not a gift exactly, just money that moved from my account to hers because the alternative was watching something with real potential die before it got a fair start, and I wasn't able to choose that. Jade's boutique worked. The city's small fashion community took to her, and she worked genuinely hard for the reputation she built there. I want to make that absolutely clear because this isn't a story about a lazy sister who coasted on someone else's effort. Jade was talented. Jade was dedicated. Jade put in the hours and the creativity and the relationship building that made the business what it became. But I'm also not going to pretend she built everything from air, the way she'd been presenting it to Marcus's family, especially Marcus's mother, who had opinions with a capital O about self-made people, about independence, about the specific virtue she believed resided in having achieved something entirely without help. The kind of woman who doesn't just want her son's future wife to be successful, but needs to believe she got there on pure personal merit, unsupported by anything or anyone that might complicate the clean narrative of self-creation. I'm not dumb. I knew walking into that hotel that I was the loose thread in Jade's story, the detail that didn't quite fit the version she'd been telling. So I practiced some internal diplomacy on the drive over. I told myself no friction, no complications, no making things difficult for her on a night that was supposed to be celebratory. I'd show up, smile, circulate, and leave quietly when it was time, invisible in the way I'd learned to be invisible, useful in the background, and absent from anything that required explanation. The party was every bit as formal and carefully curated as you'd expect from a family like Marcus's. High ceilings and centerpieces that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and servers in black who appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as efficiently. It was fine, genuinely, at first. I found the people I knew from Jade's life, the friends who'd been around long enough to know the actual story, and who asked about my work like people who remembered my own life existed alongside hers. I wandered with a glass of wine, watching Jade move through her own night with the open, guileless confidence that had always made me simultaneously proud and a little envious. The ease of someone who has never had to work very hard to be the person other people want to look at. I was almost having a nice time. That's the detail that still gets me, how close I was to just having a pleasant, unremarkable evening. I was crossing the room toward her when I saw it. That flicker across Jade's face I'd been reading for 30 years, the heartbeat of calculation that preceded the dazzling smile she used when she needed something to go down easy. The audience this time was Marcus's mother and 2 of his aunts, her most significant crowd yet, the people whose impression of her had been most carefully managed. She called me over with a wave, included me in the circle with a gesture that was perfectly warm on the surface, and said with a little laugh designed to make it all charming and harmless, "Oh, this is Nora." She was basically our family housekeeper for years, kept everything running while I was getting the business off the ground. The laugh. That's the part one keep coming back to, not the sentence itself, as bad as the sentence was, but the laugh, which was so specifically calibrated, so practiced in its lightness. In one sentence and one laugh, she turned 6 years of my life into a quirky support staff detail. A fun little anecdote about humble origins that made her look even more impressive by contrast. The entrepreneur who'd had this interesting homegrown infrastructure around her while she built something real. Marcus's mother gave me the polite smile you give the event planner's assistant when you're at a party and don't want to be rude. One of the aunts said something about how important good support systems were when you were building something. Jade agreed warmly and steered everyone toward the canapé table, and I stood there for a moment in the specific, suspended way of a person who has just heard something said about them that requires several seconds to fully process. Nobody corrected it. Why would they? They had no reason to. I stayed longer than I wanted to, and I want to be honest about why, because it wasn't bravery. It was calculation, the same calculation I'd been making for 6 years. The understanding that leaving immediately would create a moment, that Jade would spend the rest of the engagement framing as my problem rather than hers, that a visible hurt response would become the story instead of what she'd actually said. So I finished my wine and got another. I nodded when people asked about my job. I ate tasteless canapés and talked to people I'd probably never see again, and watched my sister work her room with the genuine ease of someone who has always been comfortable being the center of things. And I waited. I caught her near the end of the evening, tucked away in a small sitting room off the main space, phone in hand, briefly unguarded in the way people are when they think they're not being watched. I came in and closed the door, and she looked up, and her expression did something that told me she'd been waiting for this, without admitting she was waiting for it. No theatrics. I want to be clear about that, because the version of this conversation that makes the best story involves raised voices and things said in the heat of the moment, and that's not what happened. What happened was 2 sisters in a quiet room with the party continuing on the other side of the wall, and 6 years of something that had never been properly named finally getting named. I told her what she'd said, the specific words, the specific laugh. I asked her if she meant it. She ran through her defenses. In the order I'd expected, it was a joke. She hadn't meant it to land that way. The moment had required a quick decision about how to handle my presence in that particular circle. I waited. I've gotten genuinely good at not interrupting when Jade is sorting her feelings out loud, because interrupting her too early just resets the cycle. When she finished, I told her my piece. I told her about the 6 years, specifically, not as a guilt trip and not as blackmail, just as fact, because I'd spent 6 years not saying any of this specifically, and I needed to say it specifically at least once. Grad school deferred, the program I'd worked hard to earn and had been genuinely excited about before everything changed, set aside and kept meaning to get back to. University fees covered, 4 years of them. The first apartment, the deposit, the months of bridging the gap between her income and her expenses while she built something more stable. The seed capital for the business, the actual amount, the real number that made the real start possible. Not charity, not a loan she'd ever been asked to repay, just the quiet financial architecture of a life she'd been able to build because I was standing behind it. I told her that her story about building it all herself wasn't invented, but it wasn't accurate, and that the difference between those two things was me, specifically my absence from the version of the story she'd been telling. My invisibility, not just in the room, but in the whole narrative she'd constructed for Marcus's family over 2 years of a relationship where she'd been performing a slightly more impressive version of herself than the one that actually existed. I told her the laugh had been the most honest thing she'd said about me in years. That the laugh told me exactly where she'd put me in her understanding of her own life. Useful background, arrangement furniture, the housekeeper who kept things running while the real story happened somewhere else. And that I wasn't going to keep sitting in that position, she cried. That's just who Jade is when she's confronted with something real. The guilt and the regret and the genuine feeling all come out through tears, and I've learned over 30 years that this is not manipulation, even when it's inconvenient, it's just how she processes. I let her cry without trying to move past it too quickly. When she asked if I was doing this to punish her, I told her no, and meant it. I told her I was done funding someone else's life while my own waited. Done choosing just this once as a permanent operating mode, done being the person who exists in the background of someone else's story, because the foreground was always already occupied. I said the money was ending, not dramatically, not as a punishment, just as a fact that had been true for a while and was now being said out loud. The arrangement that had lived unnamed between us for 6 years finally had a name and an expiration date, and I needed her to hear both. She asked what I meant precisely. I explained it. The monthly contributions that she'd come to rely on during slow business months were stopping. Not immediately, not to leave her without any transition, but stopping. Because I had been subsidizing the slow months for 3 years, and the business was real now and had been real for long enough that it could carry its own slow months without my account as backup. I believed she'd built enough to manage it, genuinely, and I told her so, because I didn't want to leave her with the impression that this was about doubt in what she'd achieved. It wasn't. It was about me, finally, for the first time in 6 years, choosing something for myself before choosing something for her. I left the hotel and drove home through a city that looked exactly the same as it always did from a car window at night, the lights sliding past without comment on anything that had just happened. I didn't cry on the drive. I sat in my living room for a long time afterward, not distressed exactly, not satisfied exactly, just inhabiting the specific, slightly vertiginous feeling of having said something true and irreversible after a very long time of not saying it. The feeling wasn't triumphant. It was something closer to the feeling after a very long-held breath finally released, which is relief and something else simultaneously. The something else being the weight of what the holding had actually cost, now fully visible for the first time. Then I opened my laptop. The grad program was still running, applications still open for the following year. I filled out the preliminary inquiry form before I could talk myself out of it, not with any sense of cinematic finality, but because I needed to see what it felt like to take a first step towards something that had always been mine and had been waiting for me to come back to it. The weeks after the party were genuinely difficult, and I want to be honest about that, rather than compressing it into a tidy resolution. Jade called a lot. She left messages that moved through the predictable stages. Apology first, then explanation, then something more honest and searching. A longer message in which she talked about the pressure she'd been feeling from Marcus's family for 2 years, how she'd been performing a more successful, more independent version of herself for so long that she'd almost started to believe it was the whole picture, the fear she had about what happened if they saw the real scaffolding underneath the finished building. I listened to every message before I called her back, which took about 2 weeks. The 2 weeks I needed to settle into what I'd said and be sure I meant it, and be ready to have a conversation rather than a continuation of an argument. When we finally talked, it was hours, the kind of conversation that moves through several emotional registers before it finds somewhere to settle. She asked if I'd do it all again, the whole 6 years, and I told her the truth, which was yes, because I'd had to, because she needed someone to, and I was that someone, and because the choosing wasn't what I regretted. What I regretted was the drift. The way temporary had become permanent without either of us naming it, the way I'd never set a horizon for what I was doing, and she'd never asked what I needed in return, and we both just let the arrangement continue indefinitely, because examining it would have required a conversation neither of us had figured out how to start. She said she'd assumed my quiet meant I wanted nothing. I told her my quiet had meant I didn't know how to ask for what I wanted in a situation where asking felt like it might break something I wasn't ready to break. Both of those things were true, and neither of us was entirely innocent in the years of not saying them. Jade married Marcus in the spring, a garden wedding on a day that turned out warmer than forecast, everything she'd planned for it, and more. I sat near the front in a dress I'd bought specifically because I liked it, not because it was appropriate or what a sister of the groom was supposed to wear, just because I genuinely liked it, which felt like an important distinction to make for myself. I watched her walk down the aisle in something she'd spent months choosing, and she was, objectively, radiant. The specific radiance of someone doing exactly the thing they hoped to do, surrounded by the people they wanted present. Marcus's mother nodded at me pleasantly at the reception. I don't know what Jade has told her since the engagement party, whether she's given Marcus's family the full story, or a revised version, or nothing at all, and I've made a conscious decision not to need to know. Some stories belong to the people who lived them, and aren't mine to track or manage or correct from a distance. What Jade tells people about where she came from and who helped her get there is hers to figure out on whatever timeline she figures it out on. I start grad school in September. That's how this ends, not with a dramatic scene or a tidy bow on 8 years of choices made in someone else's direction. Just the next step finally happening, 8 years after I first planned to take it. I'm 32. The program is 3 years, so I'll finish at 35, which is older than I imagined being when I first got accepted and deferred, and told myself it would only be for a year. 35 isn't too late. I remind myself of that on the quiet evenings when I sit with the question of what the last 8 years actually cost me, whether the math worked out, whether I'd make the same choices, knowing how things turned out. The honest answer is yes and no simultaneously, which is not a satisfying answer but is the only accurate one. Yes, because she needed someone and I was that someone and I don't regret loving her enough to do it. No, because I should have named the arrangement sooner, should have set a horizon, should have said out loud what I was doing and why and for how long, instead of letting it continue indefinitely, because indefinite was easier than the conversation about what it actually was. But behind all the complicated feelings about the years I spent building someone else's story while mine waited, I still have this basic unchanged love for my sister that made it through the hotel sitting room and the engagement party and all the difficult, honest conversations that followed. That love didn't require the years to have been fair to survive them, and maybe that's its own kind of answer to the question of whether it was worth it. I loved her. I funded her. I lost myself in the second one for considerably longer than I should have. And then, One night in a quiet hotel room with a party on the other side of the wall, I found my way back to something I'd set down and not realize I'd been waiting to pick back up. That's the whole of it. The rest is September, and September is mine.